"Margaret, I need to tell you something," Emily whispered, her voice barely carrying across the polished oak table. I paused mid-motion, my hand hovering over the silver gravy ladle, the flicker of the chandelier catching the tears that hadn't fallen yet in my eyes. The room was filled with the low hum of family chatter, the clinking of plates, the faint scent of roasted turkey and sage mixing with the polished linen of the dining table. Everyone else laughed at a shared memory, oblivious to the silent storm brewing inches away from where I sat. I took a slow breath, steadying myself as if the world had narrowed to just the two of us in that moment. The words Emily chose were deliberate, soft yet loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to process. I remembered the way she had always approached family gatherings, with that polished smile that barely touched her eyes, the careful way she distributed attention to make sure no one noticed the cracks beneath the surface. I set the ladle down, my wrist brushing the cool silverware, and met her gaze steadily, allowing no tremor in my voice or posture to betray the tumult inside. Outside, the sun had begun to dip behind the maples lining our suburban street, sending golden streaks across the windows, and the shadows of the branches stretched across the polished floor as if mirroring the unease settling over the room. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly, hands folded in front of her, her breath catching in a subtle, unspoken way that drew my attention to the precise moment she realized I understood the gravity of her confession. I felt the weight of decades pressing down. Every holiday meticulously prepared, every birthday remembered, every small gesture of care and love that I had invested into this family. And yet here I was, confronted with a revelation that threatened to redefine all of it. The silver candlesticks on the table reflected the room in fractured light, each shard of reflection echoing pieces of my memories. Laughter, arguments smoothed over, quiet nights of planning for family dinners, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, George's quiet chuckle in the corner of the room. I let my eyes drift briefly to the empty chair at the head of the table, imagining the echo of his presence, the man who had built a life with me here, who had taught me patience and resilience, who had encouraged kindness even when it was not returned in full measure. And then, slowly, deliberately, I turned my attention back to Emily, noting the way her expression shifted imperceptibly, a flicker of anxiety crossing her features, the subtle tightening of her jaw. I reminded myself to breathe, to observe, to measure each micro-expression, knowing that in these small details lay the truth of her intentions. The room's ambient sounds, forks scraping plates, the quiet murmur of conversation, the distant sound of a clock ticking from the hallway, formed a rhythm that I matched with my own steady pulse. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I merely nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without surrendering to them, allowing the tension to linger in the air, thick and palpable. In that quiet exchange, I realized the enormity of what had been revealed, the labyrinth of emotions that would follow, but I also understood that the first step was to remain poised, to gather information, to silently plan without letting the chaos of shock dictate my movements. The silver tray in front of me held untouched cranberry sauce and rolls I had prepared hours earlier, but my mind was elsewhere, cataloging, analyzing, anticipating. Every flicker of Emily's hand, the subtle weight of her voice, the careful modulation of her inflection, all of it was data now, a map for navigating the uncertain terrain ahead. I sipped my water slowly, letting the cool liquid anchor me to the present while my thoughts spiraled outward, replaying past conversations, past smiles, past assurances that now felt colored by duplicity. Outside, the light shifted toward twilight, shadows lengthening, the house settling with a soft creak that reminded me of its age and the care George and I had taken to maintain it. I let a quiet exhale slip through my nostrils, measured, controlled, not a surrender but a preparation, a subtle assertion of the calm that would carry me through the unraveling of this moment. And in that silence, in the unspoken tension stretching between us, I found a strange clarity. I would witness, I would record, I would understand before any decision was made. I would not let the shock alone dictate my response. I let the fork rest beside my plate, turned slightly in my chair, and regarded her without accusation, without fear, only with the quiet determination of someone who had seen decades of life, who had navigated betrayal in its myriad forms before, and who would now meet this new revelation with the same unwavering steadiness that had carried her through every challenge to this point. The room fell into a subtle tension, the chatter around the table fading into a background hum, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the shift in energy. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, eyes scanning the polished surface of the table, noting the reflection of the chandelier in the silverware. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight cast long, golden rays across the kitchen floor, brushing against the patterned rug and the legs of chairs where family members sat, unaware of the silent storm brewing in my mind. I could hear the soft scrape of chairs as someone shifted, the delicate clink of a fork against a plate, yet these sounds seemed distant, muted by the focus I had trained on observing Emily. She was sitting across from me, her posture careful, hands resting in her lap, a smile that did not reach her eyes. I allowed myself a measured breath, letting the rhythm of my heartbeat settle into a quiet steadiness, reminding myself that calm observation often revealed more than immediate reaction. My thoughts drifted to the week prior, the conversations and interactions that had seemed ordinary at the time, now forming a web of subtle hints, a pattern emerging in retrospect. The way Emily had lingered near my son, the timing of her phone calls, the slight shifts in tone when discussing family matters, all of it now aligning in a way that demanded attention. I considered my own responses, the careful neutrality I had maintained, the gentle guidance offered in small gestures, every meal prepared, every holiday meticulously planned, and how these had been met with smiles and polite acknowledgement rather than genuine gratitude. A quiet frustration built, not loud, not accusatory, but measured and controlled, a simmering awareness of the imbalance that had quietly persisted over months, now brought into sharp relief. I reached for my glass of water, feeling the cool surface against my fingers, a grounding sensation in the midst of mental calculations and reflections. I remembered my late husband, George, his quiet wisdom, the way he had encouraged patience, observation, and discernment in navigating family dynamics. His absence was palpable in this moment, a reminder of the solitude that accompanied experience, and yet also a source of internal strength. I traced the rim of my glass with my finger, considering the coming days, the conversations to have, the silent watchfulness to maintain, the strategy inherent in measured patience. I allowed my gaze to drift to the corners of the room, noting small details, the slight sag in the kitchen ceiling, the faint smell of rosemary lingering from the roasted vegetables, the way the light caught the edges of the framed photographs lining the wall, each capturing moments of joy and routine now layered with complex emotion. I made mental notes, cataloging every nuance, every subtle signal, every potential avenue of information. Emily shifted slightly, a movement that caught my attention, and I noted it without comment, the quiet power of presence and observation grounding me in the reality of what was unfolding. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, the afternoon light fading toward evening, the sounds of distant traffic filtering through the windows, the faint rustle of leaves in the yard outside. In this controlled stillness, I found clarity, a focus sharpened by awareness, an understanding that the unfolding events required patience, measured action, and the steadfast maintenance of composure. I sipped my water, setting the glass down with deliberate care, each motion an assertion of calm and deliberate intention, a quiet signal that I was neither unaware nor unprepared, and that the unfolding narrative would be met with the full measure of thoughtful observation and steady resolve. I allowed myself a quiet moment, letting the soft golden light from the windows wash over the polished dining table, highlighting the faint scratches and imperfections that told stories of past gatherings, laughter, and occasional disagreements resolved with patience and care. The aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood, creating a sensory map of familiarity and long years of family life. Margaret observed the room with a steady gaze, noting the positions of each family member, their posture, the small gestures of hands folded on laps, the way shoulders slumped slightly when conversations veered into casual teasing. She recalled subtle shifts from previous weeks, the late-night calls her son David had taken in the kitchen, the whispers and glances that seemed inconsequential at the time, but now formed a subtle pattern of behavior. Emily, seated a few chairs away, adjusted her napkin with precision, a tiny motion that drew Margaret's attention, a micro-signal in a sea of ordinary actions, hinting at planning or thoughtfulness carefully disguised. Margaret's eyes lingered on each plate, each glass of water, each untouched side dish, the minutiae of domestic life carrying weight in her observation, cataloging every detail. The quiet murmur of conversation around her became a rhythm to match, punctuated by the occasional laugh or clink of silverware, none of it distracting from the concentrated awareness that had become second nature. She allowed herself a slow sip of water, feeling the cool liquid center her in the present moment, her thoughts weaving through the past and present simultaneously. Memories of George's guidance surfaced, his voice echoing in her mind, reminding her of patience, the subtle power of observation, and the quiet confidence that comes from experience. Margaret noted how the shadows from the window frames fell across the floor and table, creating subtle contrasts and highlighting aspects of the room she might otherwise overlook. Each reflection in the polished silverware and glasses became a fragment of reality, refracted and multiplied, offering a layered perspective. On the scene before her, she considered the way conversations meandered, how humor was used lightly to cover unease, and how small gestures conveyed meaning beyond words. Every laugh, every sigh, every shift in seating arrangement was logged mentally, a strategic map of relational dynamics. The distant hum of traffic from the street outside and the occasional bird song from the yard blended into the background, a gentle reminder of the world continuing beyond this charged space. Margaret's focus was unwavering, her posture calm, her breathing steady, maintaining a presence that was both grounded and vigilant. She sensed Emily's subtle tension, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her glass, the slight flush that appeared and vanished across her cheeks. These details were pieces of a larger puzzle that Margaret intended to solve quietly, methodically, understanding that the power of knowledge and observation often outweighed immediate confrontation. In the midst of domestic normalcy, Margaret's mind mapped intentions, possibilities, and potential outcomes, each thought weighed with precision. The soft rustle of napkins, the measured clink of utensils, and the faint creak of chairs were no longer ordinary sounds, but signals in a pattern she was decoding with quiet acuity. Margaret did not speak, did not flinch, did not reveal the stirrings of calculation within her mind, choosing instead to absorb, to note, and to prepare, allowing the subtle shifts in behavior and the faintest of gestures to inform the careful strategy she was quietly assembling within herself, a silent readiness to navigate the complex terrain of familial revelation with poise and discernment. Margaret allowed her gaze to drift around the room once more, noting the subtle interplay of shadows and light as the late afternoon sun began to wane, casting warm amber streaks across the polished wooden floor. The air was thick with the aroma of the baked turkey and the lingering scent of rosemary, a sensory reminder of the careful preparations she had undertaken earlier that day. Each plate was meticulously arranged, glasses filled with water catching glimmers of sunlight, and the silverware reflecting the soft glow, yet these outward signs of order contrasted sharply with the quiet tension she felt coursing through the room. She reflected on the past weeks, the small incidents that had seemed inconsequential at the time, the way Emily had subtly redirected conversations, the fleeting glances exchanged with her son David when he thought she was not watching, the carefully timed pauses that made ordinary moments feel slightly off. Margaret recalled the phone calls, the whispered conversations just outside earshot, and the way minor domestic details had shifted subtly, creating a network of small signals now coalescing into a discernible pattern. Her fingers lightly traced the edge of her glass, grounding her as she cataloged each nuance of body language, each change in tone, each calculated smile, assembling a mental map of interactions that had once been dismissed as ordinary. The sunlight shifted imperceptibly, the shadows stretching across the chairs and the table, a quiet echo of the complexities within the family structure she had nurtured for decades. Margaret thought of George and his patient guidance, his voice reminding her of the strength that came from observation, the wisdom in listening and perceiving the unspoken, and the power inherent in responding deliberately rather than impulsively. She noticed Emily's hands now, lightly pressed against the tablecloth, tapping in rhythm with an invisible metronome, a small gesture loaded with unspoken intent. Every laugh, every sigh, every careful modulation of conversation was noted with precision, forming a web of understanding that Margaret could navigate with steady composure. The soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of children playing in the yard outside blended into a background that Margaret used to time her observations, measuring pauses, noting hesitations, and recording subtle interactions in her mind. She reflected on her own behavior in these moments, the measured calm in her expressions, the deliberate neutrality in her responses, understanding that the power of restraint and silent awareness often carried greater weight than immediate reaction. Each reflection in the polished silverware, each shimmer of light across the glassware, each ripple in the surface of the water became an instrument through which she could interpret the dynamics of the room, the underlying tensions, and the intentions she had long suspected. Margaret sipped her water slowly, the cool sensation a tether to the present, allowing her mind to parse the myriad signals with clarity, patience, and quiet authority. The patterns were emerging. The small hints that had once seemed innocuous now pointed clearly toward intention and design, and Margaret felt a renewed steadiness, a sense of control that came from understanding and careful observation, the foundation upon which she would navigate the unfolding complexities of her family's interactions. Margaret felt a quiet shift in the room as her granddaughter Sophie, a perceptive 18-year-old with an innate sense of awareness, leaned slightly forward and whispered a comment meant only for her ears. The words were carefully chosen, subtle, yet they confirmed suspicions Margaret had been quietly nurturing over the past weeks, a confirmation of behavior she had noticed but could not yet fully prove. The soft afternoon light caught Sophie's hair, golden strands falling across her shoulders, and Margaret noted the small, unspoken cues in the way she fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, the way her eyes darted occasionally toward Emily, and the micro-expressions that passed over her young face. Every detail became data in Margaret's mind, a map of interactions, intentions, and subtle manipulations. Margaret sipped her water slowly, letting the coolness ground her, and reflected on the days prior. The whispered phone calls, the carefully timed interactions, the almost imperceptible attempts to redirect attention and control the flow of conversation. The dining room, with its polished wooden floor and carefully arranged silverware, seemed to hold its breath as if acknowledging the gravity of the exchange taking place at one end of the table. The scent of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread lingered in the air, comforting yet juxtaposed against the tension she perceived, highlighting the contrast between surface normalcy and underlying complexity. Margaret considered the way her late husband George had always advised her to observe, to understand before acting, to note each detail, however small, and to trust her own assessment of character and intent. She allowed her eyes to move across the table again, taking in the subtle shifts in posture, the barely perceptible tightening of Emily's jaw, the careful positioning of her hands, and the slight hesitation before responding to her son's casual questions. Every micro-moment carried weight, and Margaret cataloged it methodically, using her keen perception to construct an understanding of motives and potential outcomes. Sophie's quiet revelations added a new layer, pieces of information that filled gaps Margaret had sensed but could not yet confirm, and she integrated them with her previous observations, creating a more comprehensive picture of the intricate dynamics at play. Outside, the light was changing, casting elongated shadows across the polished floor, mirroring the shifting contours of the evening, and Margaret noted how each subtle movement in the room reflected deeper currents of intent. The gentle murmur of voices, the quiet clatter of utensils, and the soft rustle of napkins formed a rhythm that Margaret matched with her own calm breathing, each exhale a tool for maintaining focus and clarity. She acknowledged Sophie's presence, offering a slight nod that communicated appreciation without disrupting the delicate balance of discretion, a silent partnership in the process of understanding and observing. Margaret's thoughts turned to the days ahead, planning silently, considering the strategic steps necessary to navigate the complexities she now understood more fully, and realizing that knowledge and measured observation were her most powerful tools in ensuring fairness and clarity within the family she had long nurtured and protected. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, feeling the cool leather of the seat beneath her, and allowed her mind to focus on the sequence of subtle actions that had brought her to this precise moment. Each gesture around the table, the way Emily adjusted her hair, the slight pause before answering a question, the careful placement of her fork, was catalogued, noted, and interpreted as part of a broader pattern of intention. The sunlight outside was soft now, filtering through the kitchen windows, casting long, warm streaks across the polished hardwood floor, highlighting the intricate grain and the gentle imperfections of age and use that spoke of decades of family life. Margaret took a measured sip of water, letting the calm liquid center her thoughts as she mentally retraced every interaction, every word, and every unspoken communication that had occurred over the past weeks. She recalled her own actions in these spaces, the patient listening, the subtle nudges toward fairness, the unspoken expectations of respect that had been quietly maintained in the household. The quiet rhythm of the dining room, the soft scrape of chairs, the muted clink of cutlery, the gentle hum of conversation, became a cadence she could navigate with precision, each sound a marker in the larger tableau of family dynamics. Margaret's eyes traveled to Sophie again, noticing the way she maintained a delicate awareness, her slight nods and subtle expressions indicating the unspoken exchange of understanding that had passed between them. This connection, though quiet, reinforced Margaret's resolve to approach the unfolding situation with calm and deliberate intent, recognizing that patience and observation were the most potent tools she possessed. She noted the placement of the remaining dishes, the careful arrangement of napkins, and the subtle sheen of the glassware, each reflecting elements of the room back to her in a mosaic of light and shadow. The faint scent of rosemary and baked bread mingled with the crisp air from the open windows, grounding her in the reality of the environment while her thoughts mapped the potential outcomes and necessary steps for navigating the complex human interactions before her. Margaret allowed herself a slow, deliberate breath, the sensation of the air filling her lungs a tangible reminder of her presence, her control, and her measured patience. Every glance, every slight movement, every fleeting expression became part of a strategic tableau in her mind, and she cataloged these elements with quiet acuity, understanding that the power of careful observation often outweighed the immediacy of action. She reflected on her late husband George's wisdom, his guidance on the subtle power of timing, discretion, and measured response, and she internalized these lessons as she considered the next steps in the silent negotiation of influence and understanding within the family. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, the room transformed in tone, the warmth of sunlight fading into soft shadows, accentuating every detail that Margaret had meticulously observed, allowing her to solidify a sense of control, clarity, and readiness for the interactions yet to come. Margaret observed the subtle shift in energy as the sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows across the polished hardwood floor and creating a contrast between the warm light and the cool areas of the room where the afternoon had yet to reach. Each reflection in the silverware and glassware seemed to magnify the nuances of the scene, the faint glint of light bouncing from one object to another forming a pattern she absorbed without missing a single detail. Sophie, sitting quietly nearby, occasionally glanced at Margaret with a mixture of curiosity and deference, understanding that she was witnessing a careful process of observation and reflection, the steady accumulation of insights and understanding. Margaret's eyes returned to Emily, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight hesitation in her responses, and the measured movements of her hands as she arranged her utensils or adjusted the napkin on her lap. Every gesture, however small, became a piece of information, a clue to intent and mindset that Margaret cataloged meticulously. The faint hum of conversation from the rest of the family created a backdrop of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the intensity of her focus. Each voice, each laugh, each pause layered with potential significance. Margaret allowed herself a slow, deliberate sip of water, feeling the cool liquid anchor her in the present while her mind traced the intricate web of interactions. patterns, and motivations that had been building over time. She reflected on the quiet lessons from George, the value of patience, and the importance of measured observation, internalizing the principle that understanding often preceded action, and that the subtleties of human behavior were rarely evident at first glance, but became clear under attentive scrutiny. The light outside softened further, the golden hue blending into the early evening tones, and Margaret noted how the changing ambience affected posture, tone, and attention, adjusting her mental map accordingly. Each glance from Emily, each small flicker of expression, each carefully timed response was logged silently, building a comprehensive view of intentions and potential strategies without a word spoken. Margaret's mind moved systematically, weighing the possibilities, imagining outcomes, and preparing for the sequence of interactions yet to unfold. She considered the placement of every object on the table, the arrangement of chairs, the distribution of light and shadow, and the positions of each person, recognizing the ways these subtle elements influenced perception and behavior. Her calm presence, deliberate movements, and quiet attentiveness conveyed authority without confrontation, an unspoken assertion of awareness and control. She felt the internal shift of power, a quiet recognition that the knowledge and understanding she held allowed her to navigate the complex dynamics with confidence and composure, ready to respond thoughtfully when the moment required, maintaining an unwavering poise that spoke louder than any words could. As the evening light deepened, Margaret remained poised at the dining table, the room now bathed in a gentle, golden haze that softened the edges of chairs and tableware, while accentuating the glint of silver utensils and the polished surfaces of glassware. The aroma of the day's cooking lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of wood polish and fresh flowers arranged in a vase nearby. Her attention, however, was focused entirely on the interplay of movements and expressions across the table. Emily adjusted her seat slightly, a minor shift that drew Margaret's notice, and she catalogued it with the precision she had maintained throughout the afternoon. Sophie's quiet observation from a nearby chair remained a steady presence, reinforcing Margaret's own clarity and confirming the subtle signals that had been building in her awareness. The low murmur of family conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of cutlery, provided a rhythmic backdrop against which Margaret measured the subtlest cues, a hesitation in speech, a flicker of the eyes, the way a hand rested on the table. Margaret allowed a small sip of water to anchor her thoughts, feeling the coolness settle her, while her mind traced the network of relationships, intentions, and emerging patterns of behavior she had discerned over hours of careful observation. Each reflection in the polished glass and silverware seemed to hold its own story, capturing nuances that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, and she used these details to refine her understanding of the dynamics at play. The soft shadows created by the fading light stretched across the floor, mirroring the invisible threads of influence and subtle control she had quietly mapped in her mind. Margaret's breathing remained steady, deliberate, a slow rhythm that mirrored the measured attention she brought to every glance and gesture. She noted the positioning of chairs, the slight lean of Emily toward her son, the subtle fidgeting of hands, and the almost imperceptible tightening of shoulders, integrating these observations into a cohesive understanding of intent and forthcoming decisions. The gentle hum of activity, from the shifting of chairs to the quiet movement of feet across the wooden floor, became part of the fabric of awareness Margaret wove, each sound a cue, each moment an opportunity to understand and anticipate. In these measured, silent observations, she found a calm authority, a sense of readiness to act thoughtfully and strategically when the appropriate moment arrived. The day's preparations, the lingering scents, the warm glow of the setting sun, and the quiet attentiveness of Sophie all coalesced to create an environment in which Margaret could assert control without confrontation, observing the unfolding scenario with unwavering clarity. Each subtle interaction and micro-expression provided insight, and she cataloged these carefully, knowing that the strength of her response would come from understanding and patience, and that the culmination of this awareness would allow her to navigate the remainder of the evening with measured confidence, maintaining her composure and guiding the situation toward clarity and resolution without disrupting the calm surface of family life. As the evening shadows lengthened, Margaret felt a quiet sense of resolution settle over her. The golden light from the setting sun, casting a warm glow across the polished hardwood floor and reflecting softly in the silverware and glasses on the table. The aromas of the day's meal lingered in the air, gentle and comforting, providing a familiar backdrop to the delicate balance of observation and reflection she had maintained. Every gesture, every subtle expression across the table had been catalogued, from the slight tension in Emily's shoulders to the careful placement of her hands, each movement now part of a clear pattern Margaret understood fully. Sophie remained quietly attentive, her subtle nods and soft expressions reinforcing the observations Margaret had collected, confirming the insights and intentions she had deduced throughout the afternoon. Margaret's mind moved through the sequence of interactions with calm precision, acknowledging the patterns of behavior, the subtle attempts at influence, and the careful orchestration of attention and focus that had been quietly tested over time. She noted how the soft shadows emphasized small movements, the way light refracted across the glassware highlighted expressions, and the gentle hum of the house created a rhythm that accentuated the intricate social dance around the table. Each sound, the scraping of chairs, the quiet clink of utensils, the muted voices of family members, became a reference point in her mental map, allowing her to navigate and understand the unspoken communications and subtle manipulations with clarity. Margaret reflected on the lessons from George, his guidance on patience, discretion, and the strategic power of observation, and she applied them silently, maintaining a composed presence that conveyed authority without confrontation. The coolness of her water glass grounded her, providing a tactile reminder of her own measured response and calm focus. She understood that control came not from immediate reaction but from deliberate, thoughtful awareness, and that her careful attention had prepared her to respond at the optimal moment. The room's atmosphere, filled with the fading warmth of sunlight and the subtle vibrancy of family activity, had become a canvas on which Margaret could interpret intentions, plan quietly, and assert her presence through quiet confidence. She catalogued every glance, every pause, every micro-expression with precision, understanding that her knowledge and observation provided an unspoken but undeniable authority. In this controlled awareness, Margaret felt the culmination of her careful observation, the clarity that allowed her to see the dynamics of her family with discernment, and the readiness to guide, influence, and protect the integrity of the household without the need for overt confrontation. Each subtle interaction, each nuance in tone or posture, was now integrated into a coherent understanding, giving Margaret a sense of quiet triumph, the power of measured awareness, and the assurance that she had maintained composure and insight throughout the unfolding evening, poised to navigate the remainder of the family interactions with deliberate clarity and thoughtful authority.